All right, let's take you back to the budget reaction now and the continued reaction, particularly on what the Minister of Finance had to say. Joining me for this conversation is Krutham political economy lead, Peter Attard Montalto, who joins us from Mexico this evening. Peter, good evening to you and thank you very much for your time. The budget process from the get-go, it faced strong opposition, particularly around the proposed VAT increase. We now have the final budget. Does it provide the clarity and commitment that the markets were looking for, you think?
Well, I think that's the nub of the question, right? The difference between the technocratic elements and the political elements. Technocratically, this is a very well put together budget. It deals with the lower VAT increase in a very positive way, protecting frontline services and grants as much as possible, also protecting important infrastructure. I think it also highlights that there is agreement within the GNU on the broad path of fiscal consolidation, on debt to GDP coming lower. But it doesn't really answer, of course, any of the political questions, really, fundamentally, which is if there is agreement and can be agreement within the GNU, particularly obviously from the DA, to get this VAT increase. There's a lot of risk ahead that I'm sure we're going to talk about in a minute, but there's political questions even inside the ANC and between, for instance, the ANC head of the Standing Committee on Finance, who said he doesn't back a VAT increase, and National Treasury. All these things are going to play out relatively quickly in the next 2 weeks.
Yeah. You talk about risks. I'm going to call it uncertainties. Do those remain? And if they do, what does investor sentiment look like?
So there's an important thing to realize, I think, here is that the law constrains the fiscal risk here to a very large degree. It prevents, without the budget being passed and the legislation around it, new spending from happening. It constrains the amount of spending overall that can happen, whilst revenue changes can happen without the approval of Parliament. So I think a lot of people don't realize that Treasury can unilaterally hike the VAT rate, now it's been announced today, without the approval of Parliament for 12 months. So when you take all that together, it means that the risks to the markets are actually very limited. But what we're talking about here is uncertainty risk. You know, are there legal challenges around VAT? Are there legal challenges around the parliamentary process? Are there political risks around the GNU stability from basically the attitude of both sides, of both the ANC and the DA? So for the markets, the true underlying risk is relatively contained. There's a lot of important additional other risks on top that we really do need to consider that will play out before the 1st of May and that penciled in VAT hike.
Yeah, I'll pose that question to you at the end about whether this budget will get the stamp of approval it needs from Parliament. But before we get there, the Finance Minister revising the GDP growth projections. Do you think that these are realistic, first of all, given the current economic conditions? But second of all, where do you see the primary drivers of growth coming from?
Well, let's not forget the last year was exceptionally weak, even ignoring some of the data issues around agriculture. I think we've talked about together on the program before. There was exceptional weakness in investment, in household demand as well, even in exports. And I think we do see some natural recovery in that anyway, coming off an exceptionally low base for this year. But basically, yes, we do think the targets for growth and the forecasts are broadly credible. We think the revenue numbers, excluding for a minute VAT, looking underneath that at the underlying momentum in revenue, are broadly credible. We're roughly in line with Treasury for next year. We're a little bit above them actually in the following 2 years after that. But really, I think the question here is the pace of reform. And that's ultimately what the DA was asking and negotiating in this period before the budget, is the credibility and pace of reform is still really a question mark. There's a lot going on that hasn't concluded on electricity market reform, the same in logistics as well. And I think whilst we can see some higher numbers around 2% growth in 2025, those mythical 3.5 type numbers we need to properly address inequality and unemployment are still beyond reach, and the Treasury is telling that in the budget today as well.
Yeah, let me latch on to the reforms that you have prompted then. The budget highlighting those structural reforms in energy, transport and logistics, including security, in order to boost business confidence. Do you think that these measures, Peter, are enough to address South Africa's long-standing economic challenges?
Well, they're definitely necessary, but I think there are other ones needed as well, right? We still need a lot of reform to early childhood education. There is some money in the budget for that as well. We need to fundamentally reform productivity from other things, not just education and skills, but also health. That's sort of left largely unanswered in this budget. But no, those big structural reforms in network industries are progressing. I think the fundamental issue here is this is not a 1 year, 2 year big bang. On logistics, for instance, we're on a 3-4 year pathway here still before we see meaningfully larger volumes moving through the logistics system. And so I think we're quite confident we're on the right path. Again, it's just pace. And what happens in the interim as we wait for those reforms to come through? It means, slower growth. It means higher unemployment ultimately. And with that, of course, come a variety of risks, both lower revenues, but also political risk we need to think about as well with local elections next year.
Let's talk about South Africa's debt trajectory. It remains concerning with the debt service costs consuming and increasing the share of this budget, Peter. How sustainable is this? And in your view, what risks does it pose, particularly to public services and economic stability?
Well, that's been a theme, obviously, the last couple of years of budgets, is a steadily rising share of GDP paid to debt service costs, now reaching up to around 5.3% of GDP or so. This is a huge amount, and I think is a problem from historic overspending, clearly in the historic lack of reforms, meaning a lack of revenue. It is starting to stabilize, though, and debt to GDP should start falling after the next fiscal year. We think that is going to happen. There's a lot of redemption of debt, which means just simply mathematically it probably falls from that peak. The question is what happens after that, and does it keep falling? And that's what the markets are really looking for, to lower the interest rates on South African debt that feeds back through to lower debt service costs in the fiscal framework, which then creates more room for the types of spending or lack of revenue changes, I should say, as well, that ultimately people are looking for. So we are on a bit of a cusp moment here of debt service costs and of debt. And I think it's going to be an important moment in the year ahead for markets, for Treasury and for the government. If they can see this through, there will be long-term gains that, as I say, can be spent on more important things.
Yeah. I'd like to end this conversation, Peter, with Colin Coleman. He spoke to us a little earlier here. I don't think I need to describe who he is, someone who enjoys quite a bit of respect both in government and business circles. Here's what he had to say about whether or not this budget will pass scrutiny in Parliament. Let's take a listen before we end.
The budget is extremely disappointing, and it's worrisome because there's no reason to believe that this budget in this form is going to get through the House. In other words, it may well be a budget that doesn't pass. The continuation with the increase of VAT hikes of 0.5% this year and 0.5% the following year appears to me to be a tone-deaf response to the failure of the first budget attempt. And this is not just a factor of the DA. If you listen to what Cosatu is saying, they won't support it. Various other parties, the Democratic Alliance and others, and various NGOs that have come out against VAT increases as a measure.
Your thoughts on his skepticism, basically, that it's unlikely to pass in Parliament?
Well, I think we have to remember it's not that simple. I think it comes back to my point earlier that Treasury has huge unilateral powers to raise VAT. It's obviously politically challenging. And it's actually hugely challenging for the committees in Parliament to amend the budget. It's certainly possible, but they basically simply don't have the capacity. I mean, they're basically barren in terms of capacity to really fundamentally do this. But Treasury would help them if they said we want to do spending cuts instead of VAT hikes. Treasury can help the committee to do that. But I think there's a very, very significant probability, to my mind, of basically an impasse here and basically of a political fallout, particularly between the DA and the ANC on this point. in the months ahead. I still come back to what I wrote in Business Day 2 weeks ago, which is, for me, the VAT hike is bizarre, and a 0.5 percentage point VAT hike is bizarre in political terms. Everyone focuses on the fact that the rich pay the most VAT, but the poor people in South Africa are still buying non-zero rated goods. This idea that a poor person in South Africa only buys, pup and things like that, I think is completely bizarre. And this is going to have a negative impact. And I think it was still preferable to try and find cuts elsewhere as opposed to a VAT hike. But this is the path we're on. And I think we have a very rocky road ahead, both technically and logistically in terms of how this works in Parliament and the politics that ultimately swirls around it. It's going to take a lot of goodwill, which I think exists still, to keep the GNU together through this process.
Peter Attard Montalto, thank you very much for your time.